Hello, Professor Clyde. This is Jared Barnick. I'm here to discuss my project proposal for our aspect-oriented programming course. Um, I had originally made the goal to abolish the need for observable object and instead use an INotifyPropertyChanged aspect that implements the INotifyPropertyChange. The other goal was to go ahead and implement an aspect that would allow me to not have to break out an auto property to call this notify property changed item here, but to allow me to leave it in an auto property and be one line. And I was able to do it, and I didn't even need this line for auto property. We'll talk more about that. However, I did want to let you know that this was way too easy, so I did a whole bunch more aspects to try to make my project a little bigger. Um, Also, just so you know, I did go through a whole bunch of these PostSharp learnings. I'm 81% of the way through. Let's go ahead and show this project. So I did say I would do a hello world, but I did a bigger project than that. I'm not just doing a hello world. This project I'm doing is a service manager. And just think of Windows Service Manager. You know, you go to Windows, you bring up its Service Manager. One of the limitations Windows has is you can't stop and start multiple services. Look at all these SQL services. It would be nice to stop and start them all at the same time. It would be awesome if we could do that. However, we cannot. We can't do that. So I wanted to create a tool that would allow me to do that. So let me go ahead and run my tool, and we'll see an example of doing that. Okay, so here is my tool. I don't have any styling done. Don't expect it to be pretty. I don't have the open option working, but I do have some of these options working. We'll talk about them later. And basically the whole goal is to be able to stop and start all these services simultaneously. Okay, so right here I can stop this service one at a time. So there's an example of stopping and starting the service one at a time. So it's pretty much the same feature set that Windows already has. The big feature set that I get from this tool that Windows doesn't provide me is the start all, restart all, stop all. I'm not 100% sure if I ever got restart working all the way. I think restart all currently just is the same as stop. That's something that's a to-do that I'll hook up. But I can click start all and everything's running. I click stop all and everything will go ahead and stop. And once it's stopped, the buttons enable. So that's just the feature set I'm trying to get. And let's go ahead and look at how I used aspect-oriented programming using PostSharp to make some of the development life easier. Okay. Alright, so we have the method trace aspect. This is the easy one where we log every method and the execution time of every method, and here's the log. As you can see, it logged it. I'm keeping track of the tabs. Very similar to what we did in Aspect-J in a previous assignment. I also have, in my MVVM framework, I have the notify property changed, and this allows us to implement the INotifyPropertyChanged class. It implements each method and the event and I also implemented NotifyPropertyChanged all. This one was an example provided by PostSharp, and since that was one of my project goals, I realized early on that, well, my project can't be focused on building this object since they've already built it. And so I decided to do more. But just to show you how that's used, we can go ahead and find my usages and look at those. So obvious place is in the view model. The view model implements NotifyPropertyChanged. One of the things I really like is that I was able to implement it for the class, and I didn't have to implement it for every set. I didn't have to put a tag on every set, but still every set implements INotifyPropertyChanged, and we'll call NotifyPropertyChanged. It's very nice and very useful. I have my each one of my properties are just auto properties, and yet they're still calling NotifyPropertyChanged, so that saves me a ton of coding, just like we expected. Okay, and so I also felt more freedom using this object because it's not a view model base object or an observable object. I felt more freedom just being able to use it wherever. So I used it in a model object. I used it on some of my singletons because I felt like I was more free to use it in places other than view models, because it's no longer tied in any way, shape, or form to the view model. So I felt kind of freed by this NotifyPropertyChanged attribute, and I was able to get rid of completely the observable object class that had before implemented NotifyPropertyChanged. And I was also able to get rid of view model base. View model base also existed up here in MVVM or in the view model, and I don't have it. It eliminated code for me. Okay, some of the other, let's see, we've gone through method trace, NotifyPropertyChanged. I also implemented background worker. And background worker basically just is a tag you put on any method, and it runs that method in the background. Very simple to implement. I was very impressed with how easy this was. I use the method interception aspect, and after I intercepted the method, I created a new background worker object. I set the do work event to, or the do work event handler to be the args.proceed, and then I called background worker.runWorker async. It was that simple. 3 lines of code to run a method in the background. Just beautiful. Now, one of the things that I did notice is I needed to do something when my background worker ended, and that was kind of hard, and the recommendation was to have a run on GUI thread. And what this does is, at the very end of your background worker, instead of having instead of overloading the completed event and adding a method that would run on the UI thread, you can just call a method at the end of your code and tag that method with run on GUI thread aspect. So if we were to look at where we used this in my view model, when I call my background worker, I am going to start and stop services using a background thread, or if I want to do all services, I will stop and start all services in a background thread. And one of the things I'm doing is I'm setting my buttons are being set to false, or the visibility or the enabled status of my buttons are being set to false, so that I can't just continually click the button and try to stop or start while it's already stopping and restarting. And the buttons would remain disabled unless I ran is working equals false and command manager.invalidate requery suggested. The The command manager.invalidate requery suggested has to run on the UI thread. So I just went ahead and created this method and tagged it with the run on GUI thread the aspect. So that's how I was able to go ahead and use those two aspects. I used so it was the background worker and the run on GUI thread assist that I used. A couple other aspects I created were default value aspect, and I had a lazy property aspect, which is very similar. I didn't end up using the lazy one. I used the default value one. These could merge. They're very similar. I'll just show you the default value one. Basically, I allow providing a default value and what value is empty, and I make sure I know if I'm on first access of the property, because anytime you have a property you may want to give it a default value, and only if it doesn't already have a value. So the empty value helps me determine, because not everything is null. For example, an int is 0 by default, and so we needed to know what the empty version was to know if it was set or not. So if we go look at where this was used, I was able to really quick add default values to all of these properties by just adding one line. I didn't have to break each of these properties out. Another option for doing this would be to put it in the constructor, and that would be fine too. Then it wouldn't even be an aspect. There's nothing wrong with putting it in the constructor except for they're initialized. They're not initialized on first use. They're initialized on construction. And one of the things I was looking for was initialization on first use. However, with just ints, there'd probably be nothing wrong with doing it in the constructor, but it's just a good example of how to use that. After that, I implemented exception aspect. Exception aspect takes an exception type and a message. It overrides the onException aspect, and I just had to override getExceptionType to return the type that I passed in. And then here is what I'm going to do when I catch an exception. I'm basically just going to create a message and a string, and then I'm going to write it to my log file. And this is really easy to see how it works. We can go look at my start and stop services. And each time I try to start or stop a service, it could throw an invalid operation exception, or it could throw a timeout exception. It could, and those are the exceptions I got. The other exception it could throw is it could throw a Win32 exception I'm not catching, as we can see here. And so that's something that could be added. But these are the only exceptions I've received, and so they're the only exceptions that I've caught. And notice I can just set the exception type to the type and set the message to whatever message I want to say. I can do the same thing for start and stop. And so, yeah, I can add two exceptions, so I'm catching both these exceptions. I don't really have an order for catching. I'm not sure if it matters. It seems to work fine. And I'm sure we could look at the actual source code in ILSpy to see if there's a specific one that's being caught. And it probably doesn't matter because of the way the try catch is created. It's only trying to catch. See, it's embedded try, and so we have multiple catches embedded. So the timeout exception is outside of the invalid operation exception. So that's how it works. and it seems to work really well. Alright, let's go ahead and look at the last aspect I created was the persist on set aspect. Just on anytime I set a property, I wanted to serialize that to XML, and so I created this iPersist interface, and anybody that implements this interface and gets applied the persist on aspect will have the, and if they're serializable, will have their information stored to XML. And I'm using that here on my column settings. And we've looked at this class already. I have some bool values that determine whether to show a column, and then I have column indexes to determine the order of the columns. Now, if we pull up my serialization file for column settings, the default value would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but notice it goes 1, 2, 3, 5, 4. That's because I've actually changed the order. If I drag this over here and pull up my file, it changes those back in order. And I can go ahead and move them and put them back. And perhaps I also even want to hide a column, such as maybe I don't want to see the actual service name because it's kind of cryptic anyway. I just want the display name. And here you can see that my show service name column is false and my order is changed. So every time I change one of those settings, it's going to be written to this XML so that it's persistent. And if I close my application and relaunch it, these settings, as you can see, are pulled from the XML and they're persistent. Alright, I think that's it. There's one thing I didn't show you. I created this aspect info, and this is how I apply the method trace aspect. I am applying it to every method pretty much in the entire namespace. And that's one way you can apply it to an entire namespace without having to apply it to everything. It's very interesting. And you can apply attributes to namespaces. PostSharp was a great tool for being able to, take the cross-cutting concerns and make them into objects. I enjoyed it, and I'm probably going to use it in production sometime. In fact, this application I'm going to release as a Landesk plugin so that Landesk users can start and stop their services. I just need to add styles, localization, and a few other features. Anyway, Professor, thanks for this semester. Thanks for teaching us about aspect-oriented programming. It was great. Honestly, I wasn't sure I was going to like the technology at first, and now, I thoroughly enjoy it. So thank you, and have a good day.